If you love classic cars, then Donald loves you. We're here in our new exhibition, Women Take the Wheel, Fashion, Modernity, and the Automobile, 1900 to 1945. We're taking a little closer look at some of the cars in the exhibition, and to do that, we're joined by our great friend, Jay Leno, who knows something about old cars.
Well, I just wandered in and I somehow got roped into being here. But it's a fabulous thing you put together here, because it's not just the cars, it's the whole social implication of the cars. And this is what museums need to do to get people in off the streets. You have, I think a lot of guys will come to see the cars, a lot of women will come to see the fashion, and people just have an interest in social history will come as well. So it's not just all about automobiles, which is what a museum should be. It should be a wide-ranging thing.
And I know for you, Jay, the story of a car, who owned it, who drove it, how they used it, is really important to you as a collector and as somebody who's a car nut.
Yeah, I always find it fascinating. I mean, this car is 1902, and actually quite advanced for the time. I mean, you had a steering wheel, which sounds ridiculous, but that wasn't standard equipment. A lot had the tiller because people thought, well, for example, the Stanley brothers thought nobody would ever drive more than 30 miles a day. That seemed just, oh my God, you're just exhausted, you're worn out because of the roads and whatnot. You probably went 5 to 6 miles an hour, and it took you a while to get there, you know. So that it has this, it has quite a few modern features which wouldn't come to most cars till later.
It's also interesting thinking about what an adventure automobiling was back at the turn of the century.
Right.
It wasn't the idea of sort of getting in the car and just sort of going to the store or going out to dinner. It was an actual adventure because the roads weren't very well developed outside of a city.
Right.
And even though the automobile was hailed as the savior of the cities because it was so much cleaner than horses,
right,
you're still totally exposed on unpaved roads.
Sure. And this, we call it a dashboard now. And where that phrase comes from, dash was another word for manure. So, and if you were behind a horse, they would throw this back at you, and the dashboard would catch that and keep it from hitting you in the face or where else, is soiling your clothes, whatever it might be. But that's where the term comes from. It's just one of those odd things that just sort of evolved as the car went along.
And this car, which is a 1902 Packard Model F, as you said, it's also very interesting because the Packard company was still fairly new at that point.
Yeah, and it was one of those deals where so many, like Enzo Ferrari, started an argument between two guys. It was
Winton.
Winton was ahead of Packard, producing cars first, and Winton thought, you know. And I guess James Packard, he bought a Winton, and he went back to he wanted to ask about the clutch, and something else wasn't. And why don't you build your own car? You know, just turn to one of those. All right, I will. You know, and that's how Packard got started. Yeah.
And even then, at this point, Packard was beginning to establish his brand as one of the highest quality cars in the U.S., actually in the world at that point.
Yeah, I mean, this is pretty, I think if the average person looked at this car, they would think 1908, maybe 1910. But for 1902, I mean, you're really just this far away from horses, really, at this point. And the fact that you had a transmission, you had 3 speeds, which is pretty amazing at the time. Most people are happy just to have 1 speed where just the fact that you were moving
forward without a horse.
Oh yeah, that was a huge deal. You know, there's a great scene in the Sam Peckinpah film, The Wild Bunch, where they're in the desert and they're at a saloon and the ground is perfectly flat, and it takes place about 1902, I think, and a car goes by and these cowboys go, what? And there's no horse pulling it, and they just see it go by. And it was a great way to symbolize the end of an era. Like, you guys are old school. That's, you know, your life.
You're about to be unemployed.
Yeah. We've moved on, you know. It was like the first space shuttle or something. You know, people just, what? How? They couldn't understand how it could move on level ground. You know, and it was just a symbol. And this, I mean, you could start it from the side here. It had a lot of safety features. You know, most cars, you cranked it, and if it was in gear and you cranked it, you got run over by your own car. I mean, that was quite common. It sounds comical, but it happened. Whereas this, you're on the side, so at least if it ran out, oh, you could step off.
There it goes. It's hitting the barn, but it's okay.
Right, exactly. So had a lot of advanced features, but the 3-speed sliding transmission, that was a huge deal because there really was no need for 3 speeds back in the day. People, like you say, were just happy to move forward. So the fact that you could get it up to a cruising speed, which is probably 8 to 12 miles an hour, something like that.
Which is pretty fast.
It is pretty fast. You know, I've got a 1906 advanced tractor. It's an enormous thing, steam, and 5 miles an hour in that thing. It weighs 7, 8 tons. So moving at 5 miles, I mean, it's the most frightening thing to drive.
And I'm sure you don't want to actually try to stop it.
Right, right. You retard progress. You don't really stop.
0 to 5 and then 5 to 0 is the frightening thing. And think about the pace of progress at this point. Let's take a look at another Packard, which is not that much newer, but a dramatically different car.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing how much that looks like the 19th century, and this looks like the 20th century.
All of a sudden, in the space of a few years.
I mean, this is the difference between almost like a Ferrari and a Model T. I mean, the engine is 4 times the size. It's 4 cylinders. And it's swoopy, it's low, it's got some modern tires, whereas those are solid rubber. Whereas, are they solid rubber?
No, those are pneumatic.
Those are pneumatic, but solid rubber was fairly common at the
absolutely.
time. Yeah, this looks like a car you could drive anywhere today.
And it's also quite interesting and quite telling in the context of this exhibition, Women Take the Wheel.
Yeah.
This is a Packard Gentleman's Roadster.
Right.
So the idea was, yes, perhaps women might be driving at this point, but this is a car that a man would drive. It's fast, it's swoopy, it's everything that you'd expect the dashing young rich playboy to be driving.
Well, it's funny you bring that up because that's what sort of hurt the electric car. The electric car was popular because you didn't need a crank, you didn't have to crank. Don't forget there's no electric start in this, so you had to be fairly strong to start it, so it would take a man to get it going. And so electric cars were marketed at women. And consequently, even today, you can't sell a man a woman's car.
Exactly.
So when you see the period ads for the electric, get your wife a Baker Electric, it was the idea that she could go just a few miles from home because the range wasn't that great and come back and go shopping and do all those type of things. Whereas the guy would have the rolls, explodes, and makes noise thing.
Exactly. She would be touring through town on the paved roads and in civilization.
Right.
Whereas the gentleman would go off dashing into the countryside for some adventure. Let's take a look at that engine because we talked about it.
4 massive cylinders by today's standards, certainly. What these are here, these are priming cups. In the wintertime, what you would do is you would put some gas in there and then you'd turn the valve and the gasoline would go directly into the cylinder and then you'd shut it again. So when you turn the ignition, the spark would fire it off. You didn't have to keep cranking it to have the vacuum suck gas and pull it in, So that was kind of cool. A magneto ignition. I like these early vehicles because everything runs independently. The ignition doesn't depend on something else. You don't need a battery, you don't need any of that. You just need to get a good spark going. You have the piston in the center. It's called the T-head because you have exhaust valves on one side and intake valves on the other. Yeah.
And so the cylinders were also cast in pairs and then bolted to the crankcase.
Right, and the reason they were cast in pairs was because a man would sit there and do each cylinder, and for example, you had a 4-cylinder block. If you screwed up one cylinder, you had to throw the other 3 cylinders away. Back in the day, they started first a single cylinder, then the dual, and then as they got better, 6 cylinders had cast in 3s, and then eventually when engineering, when it got good, when precision engineering came into play, they could do all 4 cylinders at once. But that was the idea behind it. For example, I have a 13 Packard with 1 bad cylinder. I'm trying to find one. I haven't been able to find one for years and years. But the other 3 are still good. I didn't have to throw the whole block away.
Now, as couples began to go out in their automobiles without escorts, something else came up, which was the chaperone seat.
Right.
And I thought that this gentleman's roadster had one, but you've corrected me that perhaps this isn't a chaperone seat.
No, well, the fun part is you're sitting right on the gas tank, which is hilarious. I mean,
So perhaps it's a mother-in-law seat.
Your mother-in-law seat. Well, you know, it's interesting because what happened once the Model T became popular and everybody could afford a car, not just the leisure class, all sorts of riffraff would take to the road. I mean, that was the fear. You know, when Henry Ford introduced the $5 a day wage, people thought, well, what are these men going to do? They're just going to drink it all away. I mean, that's
or buy a Ford and drive into my neighborhood. And
right. Well, that was the fear, quite legitimately among rich people, that, you know, workers would just use the extra money to buy liquor and alcohol and that type of thing. But so I have an article that was written, would a Christian buy an automobile? I think not, says the Reverend so-and-so. And it goes on and why a Christian wouldn't have an automobile, that kind of thing. But they used to have a thing called the chaperone seat. Like a Model T, a man could take a woman out unescorted, which was fairly common, and they would drive to some desolate place, and you know, terrible things would happen.
Back in the day?
Back in the day, yeah. So to prove that you're a good Christian car dealer, you would install what they call a chaperone seat, a little seat like this, or a little stool off to the side, where
on the running board.
Sometimes on the running. Well, no, it started in the passenger compartment. So, so a brother or somebody like that.
Some other designated.
Could go along. Because, you know, years ago, I was touring with Perry Como. This is like 40 years ago, more than 40 years ago. And he had an Italian guy with him who was dating this Italian girl. And her two brothers would come with them on every date. And they used to go, first the ring, then the thing. That's what they would say. First the ring, then the thing. And they would stay in the motel, and the two brothers would sleep in one bed, and the sister would sleep in the other bed. So my friend who would work with Perry, he just couldn't get near this girl. These two brothers went everywhere. I mean, it was just like, it couldn't get more old school. And that was fairly common. So a lot of car dealers would install what they call a chaperone seat. So if they sold a car to a single man, they made sure there was a chaperone seat so that he was a gentleman, you know. And then as the 20s came along, the seat went on the running board, and sometimes even put it back here as a joke, you know, just kind of a little shot to the Christian groups for that type of thing. Because that was the Roaring 20s, and, you know,
anything
women
goes.
were drinking and anything goes. That was even the hit song, Anything
Exactly.
Goes. Yeah. So kind of interesting, social mores and all that, you know.
It is astonishing, and it's one of the ways that we see how the automobile changed women's roles in society. We'll come back with more videos on this exhibition shortly.